New Orleans, a city where the past and present blend in ways that can make your skin crawl. For many, it's a place of music and culture, but for others, it's a place where shadows walk among the living. Miguel, a trucker from Mexico living in the United States without proper papers, found himself drawn into this eerie world. Desperate to earn enough to secure his green card, he took on a late-night delivery to a mansion in New Orleans. What seemed like a simple job soon turned into a descent into the unknown. As he drove through the foggy streets, he could feel eyes on him, a presence lurking just out of sight. The city itself seemed alive, pulsing with a dark energy that made every hair on his body stand on end. And as he arrived at the mansion, a place that looked like it had been plucked from a nightmare, Miguel knew this delivery would be like no other. Something was waiting for him inside, something that had been waiting for a long time. Miguel parked his truck in front of the mansion, its old bricks barely visible in the dim light of the moon. The place looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds and vines crawling up the walls. Yet, the windows were intact, and the front door stood slightly open, as if someone had been expecting him. The uneasy feeling in his gut grew stronger, but Miguel pushed it aside. He had a job to do, and he couldn't afford to let fear get the best of him. As he stepped out of the truck, the air around him seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. Every sound was amplified, the crunch of gravel under his boots, the distant rustling of leaves, even the steady thump of his own heartbeat. He glanced around, but the street was empty, not a soul in sight. Only the mansion loomed before him, waiting. Miguel grabbed the first piece of furniture, a heavy wooden chair with intricate carvings, and made his way to the front door. With each step, the weight of the chair seemed to increase, as if the mansion itself was pulling it in. When he reached the door, he paused, staring into the dark hallway that lay beyond. It was pitch black inside, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow up any light. He hesitated, but then, taking a deep breath, he crossed the threshold. The moment he stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him. Miguel turned quickly, but there was no one there, no breeze, no sign of anything that could have closed the door. The silence inside the mansion was deafening. It was as if the place had been frozen in time, with not a single sound breaking the stillness. He set the chair down in the entryway and reached for his flashlight, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing more of the mansion's interior. The walls were lined with old, faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. Miguel felt a chill run down his spine, but he shook it off, telling himself it was just an old house, nothing more. He needed to finish the delivery and get out. Miguel returned to the truck, grabbing another piece of furniture, a large mirror framed in dark wood. As he carried it inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He paused at the foot of the grand staircase that led to the upper floors, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him. The mirror in his hands reflected the dark hallway behind him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move, just out of the corner of his eye. He spun around, but the hallway was empty, just as before. With a growing sense of unease, Miguel continued his work, moving back and forth between the truck and the mansion. Each time he entered the house, it seemed to grow darker, colder, as if it were feeding off his fear. The shadows lengthened, and strange noises began to echo through the halls, creaks and groans, the sound of something scraping against the floor, the faint whisper of voices just beyond his hearing. As he placed the last piece of furniture, a tall grandfather clock, in the main hallway, the clock began to chime. Miguel jumped, nearly dropping the clock in surprise. The chimes echoed through the mansion, their sound deep and resonant, as if coming from the very heart of the building. Miguel stared at the clock, which had not been wound or set, yet it ticked away, marking the time with eerie precision. The clock struck midnight, and the chimes stopped abruptly, leaving the mansion in silence once more. But this time, the silence was different. It was charged, as if something had awakened, something that had been lying in wait for this exact moment. Miguel felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized that he was not alone in the mansion. Something was there with him, something that had been waiting for him to finish his work. Miguel stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the echoes of the clock's chimes faded into the oppressive silence. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Miguel wanted nothing more than to leave, to run out the door and never look back, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the air around him had thickened, rooting him to the spot. Suddenly, a soft creak broke the silence, coming from the far end of the hallway. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned to look. In the dim light, he could just make out a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, with a faint glow seeping through the crack. He knew he should leave, that nothing good could come from investigating further, but something compelled him to move forward, as if he were being drawn by an unseen force. Each step felt heavier than the last, his boots echoing loudly in the stillness. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the door at the end growing closer at an agonizingly slow pace. The glow from the door grew brighter as he approached, casting eerie shadows on the walls that seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. Miguel's hands shook as he reached out to push the door open, the wood cold and smooth under his fingertips. The door swung open silently, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The glow he had seen was coming from a single candle placed on a table in the center of the room, its flame flickering gently. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a few pieces of old, dust-covered furniture and a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror immediately caught Miguel's attention. It was the same one he had brought in earlier, but now it seemed out of place, as if it had always belonged in that room. As Miguel stepped into the room, the door behind him creaked shut, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The flickering candlelight cast strange, shifting shadows across the walls, making the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Miguel's eyes were drawn back to the mirror, its surface reflecting the room around him. But as he stared into it, he noticed something strange. The reflection didn't quite match the room he was standing in. The shadows were different, darker, and there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection, there was a figure standing behind him. Miguel spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but the room was empty. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, echoing off the walls. He turned back to the mirror, his hands trembling as he forced himself to look again. The figure was still there, standing just behind him, its features obscured by shadow. It was tall, with a long, tattered cloak that seemed to melt into the darkness. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the figure wasn't just a reflection, it was real, and it was getting closer. He took a step back, his mind racing, but the figure moved with him, staying just out of reach, its presence looming over him like a dark cloud. The air in the room grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on him. Miguel could feel the figure's cold gaze on him, could sense the malice emanating from it. The terror that had been building inside him threatened to overwhelm him, but he knew he had to stay calm, had to find a way out before it was too late. Miguel took another step back, his eyes locked on the mirror, but his foot caught on something, sending him stumbling backward. He hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of him as the room spun around him. The candle on the table flickered wildly, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. The figure in the mirror loomed larger, its dark form seeming to swell and grow, filling the mirror's surface with darkness. Desperate, Miguel scrambled to his feet, his mind racing for a way out. He could feel the figure closing in on him, could hear the soft rustle of its cloak as it moved. He had to escape, had to get out of the mansion before it was too late. With a burst of adrenaline, he turned and bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached for the handle, the room was plunged into darkness, the candle extinguished by an unseen force. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. Then, out of the blackness, came a whisper, a soft, malevolent hiss that sent chills down Miguel's spine. The voice was low and distorted, its words unintelligible, but the intent was clear. It was a warning, a threat, a promise of what was to come if he didn't leave. But Miguel was already reaching for the door, his fingers brushing the cold, smooth surface of the handle. With a desperate yank, he wrenched the door open and stumbled into the hallway, his heart racing. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls. He didn't stop to look back, didn't dare to. He just ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty mansion as he fled from whatever it was that had been waiting for him in that room. Miguel's footsteps echoed through the empty halls as he fled the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every corner he turned, every shadow he passed, felt like a potential hiding place for the dark presence that had haunted him in the mirror. The mansion seemed to close in around him, the walls narrowing, the corridors stretching into an endless maze. He knew he had to find the exit, had to escape before whatever was hunting him caught up. But the mansion wasn't going to let him go so easily. As he ran, the temperature dropped further, each breath he took condensing in the icy air. The shadows around him seemed to pulse and shift, as if alive, moving of their own accord. He could feel them closing in on him, tightening the noose of fear around his heart. The hallway ahead twisted and turned, and no matter how fast he ran, the exit eluded him, like a cruel trick being played by the house itself. Miguel skidded to a halt as he reached a fork in the corridor. To his left, the hallway stretched on, disappearing into darkness. To his right, a set of stairs spiraled downward, the steps old and worn, leading to an unknown destination. He had no time to think, no time to weigh his options. He chose the stairs, hoping against hope that they would lead him to safety. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended, each step echoing ominously in the enclosed space. The walls here were closer, pressing in on him, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. The deeper he went, the more he felt the presence of something watching him, tracking his every move. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs was impenetrable, a void that seemed to swallow all light. As Miguel reached the bottom step, he hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He was deep underground now, far from any chance of escape. The corridor ahead was narrow, the walls cold and damp to the touch. The only light came from a single flickering bulb far down the passage, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Miguel took a deep breath and forced himself to move forward, his footsteps slow and cautious. The air here was different, heavy with the scent of something old, something that had been buried for a long time. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as he noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them directly. He didn't recognize them, but they filled him with a deep sense of dread, as if they were a warning of the horrors that lay ahead. As he moved deeper into the underground corridor, the whispers began again, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. The voices were all around him, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that filled his mind with fear. He couldn't understand the words, but their intent was clear. They wanted him to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. But there was no turning back now. Miguel had to know what lay at the end of the passage, had to find out what had drawn him into this nightmare. The corridor ended in a heavy wooden door, ancient and cracked, with more of the strange symbols carved into its surface. Miguel reached out, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, the sound echoing through the darkened passage like a death knell. Beyond the door was a large chamber, dimly lit by torches that lined the walls. The flickering flames cast long, eerie shadows across the room, revealing an altar in the center, draped in tattered black cloth. Miguel stepped into the chamber, his eyes wide with terror as he took in the scene before him. The air was thick with the smell of burning incense, the smoke curling around him like a living thing. The altar was covered in strange artifacts, bones, rusted metal, and dark, twisted objects that defied explanation. But it was what lay on the altar that made Miguel's blood run cold. A book, old and bound in leather, sat open on the altar, its pages filled with the same strange symbols he had seen on the walls. The writing seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the ink shifting and changing as if it were alive. Miguel felt a powerful urge to step closer, to reach out and touch the book, but he knew instinctively that it would be a mistake. The book was the source of the evil in the mansion, the focal point of the dark energy that had ensnared him. But before he could react, the door behind him slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The torches flickered out, one by one, leaving Miguel alone in the blackness. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, filling the room with their malevolent intent. The air around him grew colder, and he could feel the presence of something closing in on him, something that had been waiting for him all along. Miguel's heart raced as he fumbled in the darkness, trying to find his way back to the door. But the room had changed, the walls shifting and twisting, trapping him within. He could feel the cold breath of the unseen forces on his neck, could hear the low growl of something inhuman in the darkness. He was out of time, out of options, and he knew that the only way out was to confront whatever it was that had brought him to this place. With a surge of determination, Miguel turned back to the altar, his eyes locked on the book. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew that the book held the key to his escape, the key to surviving the horrors that had ensnared him. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the pages, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar, the darkness closing in around him like a shroud. Miguel's hand trembled as it hovered over the ancient book. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They urged him to open the book, to read the words that had been written in a language long forgotten. But deep down, Miguel knew that whatever was written on those pages was not meant for the eyes of the living. It was a gateway, a conduit for the dark forces that had been waiting in the shadows. The cold breath of the unseen presence was at his back, a constant reminder that he was not alone in the chamber. The air was thick with the smell of decay and old incense, the smoke curling around him like tendrils of darkness. Miguel could feel the weight of the evil that permeated the room, pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under its force. He had to make a choice, stay and confront the terror head-on or run and risk being consumed by it. With a deep breath, Miguel made his decision. He grasped the edge of the book and, with a surge of adrenaline, slammed it shut. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The darkness in the room seemed to recoil, pulling back as if the book's closure had severed its connection to the malevolent forces. For a moment, Miguel thought he had won, that he had banished the darkness and saved himself from whatever horror had been waiting for him. But as he stepped back from the altar, the room began to shake. The ground beneath his feet rumbled, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The symbols on the book's cover glowed with an unnatural light, and the air crackled with energy, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Miguel staggered backward, his eyes wide with terror as the book began to levitate, rising slowly from the altar. The pages fluttered open, and a low, guttural growl filled the chamber, resonating from the very depths of the darkness. The book's pages turned on their own, faster and faster, the symbols glowing brighter with each turn. Miguel could feel the energy building, a dark power that was about to be unleashed. The growl grew louder, filling the chamber with its bone-chilling sound. Miguel's heart raced as he realized that he had not stopped the darkness, he had only unleashed something far worse. The presence that had been lurking in the shadows was now fully awake, fully aware of his existence. It was coming for him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Desperate, Miguel turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the chamber as he fled. The walls seemed to twist and shift around him, the darkness reaching out to ensnare him, to pull him back into its grasp. He could hear the low growl following him, growing closer with each passing moment. The door to the chamber loomed ahead, barely visible in the dim light, and Miguel knew it was his only chance. With every ounce of strength he had left, Miguel lunged for the door, his hands gripping the handle. But as he pulled it open, a force stronger than anything he had ever encountered slammed it shut again. The darkness around him surged, the growl turning into a deafening roar. The chamber shook violently, and Miguel was thrown to the ground, the impact knocking the breath out of him. He struggled to get back to his feet, but the darkness had already closed in, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. The growl was now a constant, reverberating through his body, filling his mind with terror. He could feel the presence of the dark force, could sense its hunger, its desire to consume him, to drag him down into the abyss from which there was no return. Miguel's vision blurred as the darkness pressed in on him, his thoughts becoming disjointed and chaotic. He knew he was losing the battle, that the darkness was too powerful, too relentless. But even as the shadows closed around him, Miguel refused to give up. With one final, desperate act of defiance, he reached out and grabbed the book, tearing it from the air and slamming it to the ground. The impact was immediate. The darkness recoiled, the growl fading into a pained howl as the book hit the floor. The energy in the room dissipated, and the oppressive weight of the malevolent force lifted, leaving Miguel gasping for breath. The chamber was still and silent once more, the darkness retreating into the corners, its power broken. But Miguel knew that this was only a temporary victory. The darkness had been weakened, but it was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. He had faced it and survived, but the battle was far from over. The book lay at his feet, its cover scorched and smoking, the symbols no longer glowing. Miguel stared down at it, knowing that whatever secrets it held, they were not meant to be uncovered by mortal hands. With trembling hands, Miguel picked up the book and turned toward the door. The mansion had returned to its eerie silence, the walls no longer shifting, the shadows no longer dancing. But the unease remained, a constant reminder of the darkness that still lingered within. Miguel knew he had to leave, to get out of the mansion before the darkness regained its strength. As he stepped into the hallway, the air felt lighter, less oppressive. But the sense of being watched, of being followed, was still there, just out of sight. Miguel glanced back at the door to the chamber, knowing that whatever had been unleashed was still down there, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon it. With the book clutched tightly in his hands, he made his way toward the exit, determined to leave this nightmare behind. Miguel made his way through the twisting corridors of the mansion, each step heavy with the weight of the book he now carried. The oppressive silence that had filled the mansion earlier had returned, but now it was different, charged with a tension that made every shadow seem darker, every corner more sinister. The walls no longer shifted, but the sense of being watched, of being followed, had only grown stronger. The air was thick with the remnants of the dark energy that had been unleashed, and Miguel knew that whatever was lurking in the shadows wasn't finished with him yet. He tried to remember the path he had taken when he first entered the mansion, but the layout seemed different now, as if the house had changed to confuse him. Every hallway looked the same, every door led to another identical corridor. The more he walked, the more lost he felt, as if he were being drawn deeper into the heart of the mansion. The sense of dread grew with each passing moment, gnawing at his resolve. Miguel's mind raced as he tried to find a way out. The book he carried felt like a burden, but he couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. Something told him that the book held the key to escaping the mansion, but it also held the power to bring the darkness back. He could feel its presence in the pages, a malevolent force that pulsed with every step he took. The whispers that had haunted him earlier returned, echoing in his mind, urging him to open the book, to read the forbidden words that lay within. He fought against the urge, knowing that to give in would mean surrendering to the darkness. But the mansion seemed to be working against him, guiding him toward the very place he was trying to escape. The corridors grew narrower, the air colder, as if the house itself were closing in on him. The sound of his own footsteps was joined by another, a faint but unmistakable echo that grew louder with each passing moment. He wasn't alone. Miguel's heart raced as he realized that something was following him, something that had been waiting in the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever was pursuing him was closing the distance. He broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fled down the endless corridors. But no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps were always just behind him, relentless in their pursuit. He rounded a corner, only to find himself in a dead-end hallway. Panic set in as he realized he had nowhere left to go. The walls loomed high around him, the only light coming from the faint glow of the book in his hands. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just behind him. Miguel turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes wide with terror. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the figure from the mirror. Tall and cloaked in shadow, it loomed over him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The air around it seemed to ripple with dark energy, the very essence of the mansion's malevolence. Miguel could feel its gaze piercing through him, as if it were looking into his soul, feeding on his fear. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Miguel backed away, his mind racing for a way out, but there was none. The walls of the hallway closed in around him, trapping him in a small, confined space with no escape. The figure continued to advance, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers in Miguel's mind grew louder, more insistent, urging him to open the book, to unleash the darkness that would consume them both. Desperate, Miguel clutched the book tightly, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. He knew that opening the book would be his downfall, but he also knew that the figure would not stop until it had what it wanted. The air crackled with energy as the figure drew closer, its shadow stretching out to envelop him. Miguel could feel the darkness closing in, could hear the low growl of the figure as it prepared to strike. In a moment of clarity, Miguel made his decision. With a surge of determination, he raised the book and hurled it at the figure with all his strength. The book flew through the air, its pages fluttering wildly, and struck the figure squarely in the chest. The impact sent a shockwave of energy through the hallway, the walls trembling as the figure recoiled in surprise. The book fell to the ground, its pages splayed open, and the dark energy that had filled the hallway began to dissipate. For a brief moment, the figure seemed to waver, its form flickering as if caught between worlds. The glow in its eyes dimmed, and the darkness that had surrounded it began to retreat. But the victory was short-lived. With a sudden burst of energy, the figure lunged forward, its cloak billowing out like a storm cloud. Miguel barely had time to react as the figure closed the distance, its hand reaching out to grasp him. The cold, shadowy hand closed around his arm, and Miguel felt a searing pain shoot through his body. The darkness that had been lurking in the mansion now coursed through him, filling him with a terror unlike anything he had ever known. The figure's grip tightened, and Miguel felt his strength draining away, his vision blurring as the world around him began to fade. But just as the darkness threatened to consume him completely, something unexpected happened. The book, lying open on the floor, began to glow with a brilliant light. The symbols on its pages pulsed with energy, and the air around it crackled with power. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it filled the entire hallway, banishing the shadows and forcing the figure to release its grip on Miguel. The figure let out a roar of rage and pain as it was engulfed by the light. The darkness that had once surrounded it was driven back, the malevolent energy dissipating into the air. Miguel fell to the ground, gasping for breath, as the figure was consumed by the light, its form dissolving into nothingness. The book snapped shut, its glow fading as the energy within it was spent. Miguel lay on the cold floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The hallway was silent once more, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The figure was gone, banished by the power of the book, but the memory of its presence lingered in Miguel's mind, a reminder of the darkness he had faced. He knew that the mansion still held many secrets, many dangers, but for now, he had survived. With a great effort, Miguel pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky but determined. He picked up the book, its cover cool to the touch, and turned back toward the way he had come. The mansion no longer felt like a maze, the corridors no longer twisting and shifting to trap him. The exit was close, and Miguel knew that he had to leave before the darkness returned. He walked down the hallway, the book clutched tightly in his hands, and stepped into the light that now filled the mansion. The shadows that had once loomed over him were gone, replaced by a sense of calm that had not been there before. But Miguel knew that this peace was only temporary. The mansion held many more secrets, many more horrors, and the book in his hands was the key to them all. As he reached the front door, Miguel hesitated for a moment, looking back at the mansion that had nearly claimed his life. He knew that he could never forget what had happened here, could never escape the memories of the darkness he had faced. But he also knew that he had survived, and that was enough. With a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving the mansion and its horrors behind. As Miguel stepped out of the mansion and into the cool night air, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. The suffocating darkness of the mansion was behind him, but the weight of the book in his hands reminded him that the ordeal was far from over. The city of New Orleans stretched out before him, its streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The familiar sounds of the city returned, distant music, the hum of traffic, and the occasional voice carried on the wind. But to Miguel, everything felt different, as if the world had shifted in some imperceptible way. He walked toward his truck, his steps slow and deliberate, as if expecting the shadows to reach out and drag him back into the mansion. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The book, now tucked under his arm, seemed to pulse with a faint energy, as if it were alive, feeding off the fear that still lingered in his mind. Miguel reached his truck and opened the door, but before he could climb inside, he hesitated. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, had returned. He scanned the street, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing there, nothing he could see, at least. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he knew that whatever had haunted him in the mansion was not confined to its walls. With a deep breath, Miguel climbed into the truck and slammed the door shut. The familiar interior should have brought him comfort, but instead, it felt foreign, as if the darkness had followed him inside. He placed the book on the passenger seat and started the engine, the rumble of the truck breaking the silence of the night. The headlights cut through the darkness as Miguel pulled away from the mansion, the sense of unease growing with each passing moment. The streets of New Orleans were eerily empty, the usual bustle of the city replaced by an unnatural stillness. Miguel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the narrow streets, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward him. The book sat on the seat beside him, its presence a constant reminder of the dark forces that still lingered. As he drove, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he half expected to see the shadowy figure from the mansion looming behind him, but the road remained empty. The unease gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing minute. The city that had once seemed so alive now felt like a ghost town, as if the very soul of New Orleans had been drained away. Miguel's thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The events of the night replayed in his mind over and over, each memory more terrifying than the last. The book had saved him, but at what cost? He knew that it held a power far beyond his understanding, a power that could bring darkness and destruction if unleashed. But even as he tried to push the thoughts away, the book seemed to call to him, its pages whispering secrets that he wasn't meant to hear. The road ahead stretched on, and Miguel felt as though he had been driving for hours, yet the city seemed to remain the same. The same buildings, the same streetlights, the same shadows. It was as if he were trapped in a loop, driving through the same stretch of road over and over again. The unease in his chest grew, a knot of fear tightening around his heart. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that he was being led somewhere he didn't want to go. Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered, and the vehicle lurched forward, nearly throwing Miguel from his seat. He slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the empty street. Panic surged through him as he tried to restart the engine, but it refused to turn over. The dashboard lights flickered, and the truck fell silent, the only sound the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. Miguel glanced around, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The street was empty, the city still shrouded in that unnatural quiet. But the sense of being watched was stronger than ever, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He reached for the book, his fingers trembling as he touched its cover. The moment he made contact, the air around him seemed to shift, growing colder, more oppressive. A low rumble echoed through the street, and Miguel's heart nearly stopped as he looked up. At the far end of the street, emerging from the darkness, was a figure, tall, cloaked, and shrouded in shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as the figure drew closer, its presence filling the street with a sense of dread so powerful it was almost suffocating. The book in his hands pulsed with energy, the symbols on its cover glowing faintly in response to the figure's approach. Miguel knew, deep down, that this was the same presence he had faced in the mansion, the same darkness that had nearly consumed him. It had followed him, hunted him down, and now it was here, standing in the middle of the street, waiting for him to make a move. Miguel's mind raced as he considered his options. He could run, but where would he go? The city was a maze, the streets leading nowhere, and the figure would follow him no matter where he fled. He could fight, but what good would it do? The darkness was too powerful, too relentless. The only thing he had left was the book, the source of the power that had saved him once before. But using it meant risking everything, unleashing a force that he barely understood. The figure took another step forward, its eyes locked on Miguel, and the decision was made. He had no choice. With a shaking hand, he opened the book, the pages glowing with a light that grew brighter with each passing second. The figure hesitated, its movements slowing as the light intensified. Miguel could feel the energy building, the power within the book surging like a storm ready to break. And then, with a deep breath, Miguel began to read. The words flowed from Miguel's mouth, each syllable strange and foreign, resonating with a power that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. The book's pages glowed brighter with every word he uttered, casting a pale light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. The figure at the end of the street stopped in its tracks, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sensed the shift in power. Miguel's voice grew stronger as he read, the words coming faster, as if the book itself were guiding him. The light from the pages swirled around him, forming a barrier that the figure could not penetrate. For the first time, Miguel felt a glimmer of hope. The darkness was powerful, but the book was stronger, its ancient words holding the key to defeating the evil that had haunted him. But as the ritual continued, Miguel began to feel a strange sensation creeping over him. The words that had once felt empowering now seemed to take on a life of their own, twisting in his mouth, forcing themselves out even as he tried to stop. The light that had been his shield began to waver, flickering like a dying flame. Miguel's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that something was wrong, terribly wrong. The book's pages began to turn on their own, faster and faster, the light growing more intense until it was almost blinding. Miguel's voice faltered, but the words continued to spill out, as if the book had taken control of him, forcing him to complete the ritual. The air around him crackled with energy, the very ground beneath him trembling as the power within the book reached its peak. The figure at the end of the street watched with a cold, calculating gaze, its eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. Miguel could feel its presence growing stronger, feeding off the energy that the ritual was unleashing. The light that had once protected him now felt like a trap, binding him to the book, to the darkness that had ensnared him from the beginning. Desperation clawed at Miguel's mind as he tried to stop the ritual, to break free from the grip of the book. But it was too late. The power that had been his salvation now threatened to consume him entirely, to drag him down into the abyss from which there would be no return. The light around him flared one last time before it was extinguished, leaving him alone in the dark, with only the glowing eyes of the figure to guide him. Miguel's hands trembled as he struggled to close the book, but it resisted, the pages turning faster, the words forcing their way out in a torrent of sound. The figure stepped forward, the darkness around it rippling like a living thing, eager to claim its prize. The street seemed to close in around him, the world narrowing to the point where all that existed was the book, the figure, and the overwhelming sense of dread that filled his mind. As the figure drew closer, Miguel felt a cold hand close around his wrist, the grip of the darkness pulling him toward the book. The power that had been unleashed was no longer under his control, the ritual spiraling out of his hands, feeding the very evil he had sought to banish. The words burned in his throat, the symbols on the pages glowing with an intensity that seared his eyes. But he couldn't stop, he couldn't escape the fate that the book had chosen for him. In one final, desperate act, Miguel summoned all his strength and slammed the book shut. The force of the action sent a shockwave through the street, the air crackling with energy as the darkness recoiled. The figure let out a howl of rage, its form flickering as the connection to the book was severed. Miguel fell to his knees, gasping for breath, the book clutched tightly in his hands, its power momentarily subdued. But the victory was short-lived. The figure still stood, its eyes burning with an unholy light, its presence as menacing as ever. The darkness that had retreated now surged forward, more determined, more relentless. The ritual had been interrupted, but the damage had been done. The book had unleashed a power that could not be contained, a force that now sought to claim Miguel as its own. Miguel struggled to his feet, his body trembling with exhaustion, the weight of the book pulling him down. The figure advanced once more, its shadow stretching out to envelop him, the darkness closing in like a shroud. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent, filling his mind with fear and doubt. The book in his hands pulsed with a malevolent energy, the symbols on its cover glowing faintly, as if waiting for the moment to strike. But Miguel refused to give in. He had come too far, faced too much to be defeated now. With a surge of defiance, He raised the book high and hurled it into the air. The book spun through the darkness, its pages fluttering wildly, before landing with a heavy thud on the ground. The moment it touched the earth, the ground shook, and a blinding light erupted from the book, engulfing the entire street in its brilliance. The figure let out a deafening roar as the light consumed it, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The darkness that had once filled the street was banished, driven back by the power of the book's final act. Miguel shielded his eyes from the light, his heart pounding in his chest as the world around him returned to normal. The city, once shrouded in shadow, was now bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, the night air cool and calm. The book lay on the ground, its power spent, its pages now blank. Miguel approached it cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate, as if expecting the darkness to return at any moment. But the book remained still, its energy depleted, the symbols that had once glowed with malevolent power now faded into obscurity. Miguel picked up the book, its weight no longer oppressive, and turned to look down the empty street. The figure was gone, its presence erased from the world, but the memory of the darkness lingered in Miguel's mind, a reminder of the power that he had unleashed. The book had saved him, but it had also brought him to the brink of destruction. With a deep breath, Miguel tucked the book under his arm and began to walk. The night was still, the city quiet, but the unease that had plagued him earlier was gone. He had faced the darkness and survived, but he knew that the journey was far from over. The book still held many secrets, and Miguel knew that he would never be free of its influence until he uncovered them all. As he walked through the streets of New Orleans, the book tucked safely under his arm, Miguel felt a sense of resolve building within him. The darkness had tried to consume him, but he had fought back, had refused to let it take control. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. And as long as he held the book in his hands, Miguel knew that he would always be one step away from the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. The streets of New Orleans seemed to return to normal as Miguel walked through them, but he knew that the sense of calm was only superficial. Beneath the surface, there was still a tension, an unease that lingered in the air. The events of the night had left their mark on the city, just as they had on Miguel. The book under his arm felt like a ticking time bomb, its power temporarily subdued but not gone. Every step he took felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. Miguel's thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The darkness, the figure, the book, it was all connected, but how? And why had he been chosen to bear the weight of it all? He had been just a trucker, trying to make a living, trying to secure a future in a country that didn't even recognize his existence. But now, he was entangled in something far beyond his understanding, something that seemed to have its roots in a world he had never known existed. As he walked, Miguel found himself drawn to a part of the city he had never visited before. The streets became narrower, the buildings older, as if you were stepping back in time. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. It was as if the city itself were guiding him, leading him to a destination he could not avoid. He turned a corner and found himself standing in front of an old, decrepit building. The sign above the door was faded, the letters barely legible, but Miguel could just make out the words, "The Archive." The building looked like it had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the door hanging off its hinges. But despite its appearance, Miguel felt a pull, a compulsion to go inside. The door creaked open as he pushed it, the sound echoing through the empty space beyond. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of old paper and forgotten secrets. Dust motes floated in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, giving the place an eerie, dreamlike quality. Miguel hesitated at the threshold, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but he couldn't. The book in his hands seemed to pull him forward, guiding him into the darkness. The interior of the building was a labyrinth of shelves, stacked high with books, papers, and artifacts. It was a place of knowledge, of history, but there was something else, something darker that lingered in the shadows. Miguel's footsteps echoed as he walked deeper into the archive, the sound magnified by the stillness of the space. The book grew warmer in his hands, as if responding to the presence of something familiar, something that had been waiting for it. As he ventured further into the archive, Miguel began to notice strange symbols etched into the walls, the same symbols that had appeared on the book. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. The air grew thicker, the sense of being watched more intense, as if the very walls had eyes, tracking his every movement. Finally, Miguel reached the center of the archive, where a large, ornate desk stood, covered in papers and strange artifacts. Behind the desk sat an old man, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses, his long, bony fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. The man didn't look up as Miguel approached, but he seemed to be aware of his presence. "Ah, you've brought it," the man said, his voice low and raspy, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Miguel hesitated, unsure of what to say, but the man simply gestured to the book. "Place it on the desk." Miguel stepped forward and laid the book on the desk, the weight of it leaving his hands for the first time in what felt like hours. The old man reached out with those long fingers and opened the book, his eyes scanning the pages with a familiarity that sent a shiver down Miguel's spine. The man's expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the way he handled the book, as if he had finally found what he had been searching for. "The answers you seek are within these pages," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But beware, for knowledge comes at a price. The darkness that you have encountered is but a fragment of a much greater force, one that has existed since time immemorial. The book is a key, a doorway to that force, and it has chosen you as its keeper." Miguel's heart pounded in his chest as the man's words sank in. The darkness, the figure, the book, it was all connected to something far older, far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, the weight of the knowledge threatening to crush him. He had been drawn into a world of shadows, a world where the lines between the living and the dead, between light and dark, were blurred beyond recognition. The old man closed the book and handed it back to Miguel, his gaze piercing through the thick lenses of his glasses. "You must be careful," he warned, his tone grave. "The book will seek to use you, to bend you to its will. It will tempt you with power, with knowledge, but you must resist. For if you fall, the darkness will consume everything." Miguel nodded, the gravity of the situation settling in his gut like a stone. He took the book, its weight once again heavy in his hands, and turned to leave the archive. But before he could take a step, the old man spoke again, his voice carrying an ominous finality. "Remember," he said, "the battle is not over. The darkness knows you now, and it will not rest until it has claimed what it seeks. Be vigilant, be strong, and above all, trust no one. For in this world, even the light can deceive." Miguel left the archive, the man's words echoing in his mind. The night outside felt colder, the shadows darker, as if the city itself were aware of the burden he now carried. The book had revealed its secrets, but it had also left him with more questions than answers. The darkness was still out there, lurking, waiting for the moment to strike. And Miguel knew that when that moment came, he would have to be ready. As he walked away from the archive, the sense of dread returned, stronger than ever. The city seemed to close in around him, the buildings looming like silent sentinels, their windows dark and empty. The night was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But Miguel was no longer the same man who had entered the mansion hours before. He had faced the darkness and survived, but the battle was only just beginning. Miguel walked through the silent streets, his senses on high alert. The darkness that had followed him from the mansion now seemed to cling to every corner, every alley. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen menace that made his skin prickle. He knew that the darkness hadn't truly left him. It had just been waiting, biding its time. The sense of being watched was now constant, like eyes boring into his back with every step he took. The city felt different now. The vibrant, bustling energy that New Orleans was known for had vanished, replaced by an oppressive quiet that made Miguel's footsteps sound unnaturally loud. The streetlights flickered as he passed, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were alive, creeping along the walls, reaching out toward him as if trying to pull him into their depths. Miguel's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do next. The book was still with him, its presence a constant weight in his hands, but he had no idea how to control its power or even if he should. The old man's warning echoed in his mind, telling him that the book would try to bend him to its will. He couldn't trust it, but he couldn't let it go either. It was both his weapon and his curse, the key to his survival and his potential downfall. As Miguel rounded a corner, he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. The temperature had dropped sharply, the air now cold enough to see his breath. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed thicker here, darker, almost as if they were waiting for him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of water dripping from a nearby gutter. Then he heard it. A faint sound, just on the edge of his hearing, like footsteps echoing in the distance. Miguel's heart skipped a beat as he realized that he wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was following him, moving through the shadows like a predator stalking its prey. He tried to pinpoint the direction of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, closing in. Miguel's breath quickened as he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't stay in one place for too long, not with whatever was out there hunting him. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, as if the pursuer was gaining ground. Every time Miguel glanced over his shoulder, he caught glimpses of movement in the shadows, fleeting shapes that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. Panic began to set in as the footsteps drew closer, echoing through the empty streets like the tolling of a death knell. Miguel's pace quickened, his heart racing, but no matter how fast he moved, the pursuer was always just a few steps behind. The city around him seemed to twist and turn, the streets becoming a labyrinth that he couldn't escape. The darkness was alive, a living entity that was hurting him, pushing him toward an inevitable confrontation. Miguel's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't keep running forever. He had to face whatever was following him, but how? The book in his hands felt like a dead weight, its power dormant, its pages silent. He couldn't rely on it, not when it had already nearly consumed him. But what else could he do? He was just one man, alone in a city that had turned against him, hunted by forces he couldn't understand. The sound of footsteps was now right behind him, close enough that he could feel the presence of his pursuer. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with dark energy, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Miguel knew that he was running out of time. Whatever was following him was about to strike, and he had to be ready. He stopped abruptly, turning to face whatever was behind him. The street was empty, the shadows still and silent, but Miguel could feel the presence of something just out of sight, lurking in the darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps as he held the book tightly, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, watching him from a nearby alley. It was tall and thin, its form distorted by the darkness, its eyes glowing faintly with a sinister light. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Miguel could feel its gaze boring into him, assessing him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Miguel's heart pounded in his chest as he faced the figure. He knew that this was no ordinary enemy, no simple threat that could be fought off with brute force. This was a creature of the darkness, a manifestation of the evil that had followed him from the mansion. It was patient, relentless, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. Miguel tightened his grip on the book, feeling its cold, smooth surface under his fingers. The book had saved him once before, but at a great cost. He didn't know if he could trust it, but he had no other choice. The figure in the alley began to move, its steps slow and deliberate, its eyes locked on Miguel with a hunger that sent chills down his spine. The final confrontation was coming, and Miguel knew that he had to be ready. The shadows around him thickened, the air growing colder as the figure approached. The darkness was closing in, and Miguel could feel its tendrils reaching out to ensnare him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The night was far from over, and the battle was just beginning. The cold air bit at Miguel's skin as he stood in the middle of the street, facing the figure that had emerged from the shadows. The silence was oppressive, thick with anticipation. The figure was closer now, its form clearer in the dim light, a tall, skeletal being, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if savoring the moment before the kill. Miguel's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure, the book heavy in his hands. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the shadows pressing closer, feeding off his fear. The figure was no longer just a pursuer, it was the embodiment of the evil that had haunted him since he first stepped into the mansion. It was the darkness made flesh, and it was here to claim him. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its glowing eyes locked on Miguel with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The air around them was thick with tension, the silence stretching on as if the city itself were holding its breath. Miguel knew that this was the moment of truth, the final stand. He had to make a choice, fight or succumb to the darkness. With a surge of determination, Miguel gripped the book tightly and took a step forward. The figure didn't react, its eyes following his every move with a cold, calculating gaze. Miguel could feel the power of the book pulsing in his hands, the symbols on its cover glowing faintly in response to the presence of the figure. The darkness around him seemed to recoil slightly, as if the book's light was enough to hold it at bay. But Miguel knew that this wasn't enough. The book had power, but it was also dangerous, unpredictable. He couldn't rely on it alone, not when the darkness had already tried to consume him once before. He needed something more, something that could turn the tide in his favor. The figure took a step closer, its skeletal hand reaching out toward Miguel, the fingers long and thin, like the claws of some ancient predator. The air around them grew colder, the shadows thicker, as if the world itself was shrinking around them, pulling them into a void where only darkness reigned. Miguel's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, a way to fight back. The book pulsed with energy in his hands, the symbols glowing brighter as if urging him to use its power. But Miguel hesitated. The old man's warning still echoed in his mind, telling him that the book would try to bend him to its will. If he wasn't careful, he could lose himself to the darkness, just as the figure had. The figure was now just inches away, its hand outstretched, the air crackling with dark energy. Miguel could feel the cold radiating from it, the darkness seeping into his very soul. The book's light was flickering, its power waning as the figure drew closer. Miguel knew that he had to act, and he had to act now. With a deep breath, Miguel made his decision. He would not give in to the darkness, would not let it consume him. He would fight, even if it meant risking everything. He tightened his grip on the book and began to recite the words he had read before, the ancient language flowing from his lips with a power that resonated deep within him. The figure recoiled slightly, its eyes narrowing as the light from the book grew stronger. The symbols on the cover flared to life, casting a brilliant glow that caught through the darkness. The shadows around them writhed and twisted, as if in pain, retreating from the light that Miguel had unleashed. But the figure was not so easily defeated. It lunged forward, its skeletal hand closing around Miguel's arm with a grip like ice. The darkness surged, pushing back against the light, trying to snuff it out. Miguel felt the cold seeping into his bones, the darkness pressing in on all sides, but he didn't stop. He continued to recite the words, his voice growing stronger, more confident, as the power of the book built to a crescendo. The light from the book flared brighter than ever, and with a final burst of energy, it exploded outward, engulfing both Miguel and the figure in a blinding flash. The darkness screamed in agony, the sound piercing the night as it was torn apart by the light. Miguel felt the figure's grip loosen, the cold receding as the light consumed it, banishing it to whatever hell it had come from. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the darkness dissipating into the night. The street was quiet once more, the oppressive silence lifted, the air cool but no longer cold. Miguel stood alone, the book still clutched in his hands, its power spent, the symbols on its cover dim and lifeless. The figure was gone, its presence erased from the world. Miguel had won, but the victory felt hollow. The battle had taken its toll on him, both physically and mentally. The darkness had been banished, but Miguel knew that it was never truly gone. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. Miguel looked down at the book in his hands, the weight of it still heavy despite the absence of its power. He knew that he couldn't keep it, couldn't risk the darkness finding a way back into the world. With a sense of finality, he walked to the nearest storm drain and dropped the book into the rushing water below. The book disappeared into the darkness, carried away by the current, its secrets lost to the depths. Miguel stood there for a moment, staring down at the drain, the sound of the water rushing beneath him a comforting reminder that the nightmare was over. But as he turned to walk away, a cold breeze swept through the street, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice, dark, malevolent, and full of promise. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. This story of Miguel's encounter with the darkness is both chilling and thought-provoking. It reminds us that sometimes, the battles we face are not just against external forces but against the darkness within ourselves. Miguel's journey through the haunted streets of New Orleans and his confrontation with the malevolent figure shows the power of determination and courage, even in the face of overwhelming terror. But it also raises questions. What would you have done in his place? Would you have had the strength to resist the temptation of the book's power, or would the darkness have consumed you? Let me know what you think of Miguel's story in the comments. Did the ending surprise you? Would you have made a different choice? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more terrifying tales. Your support means a lot, and it helps us continue to bring these chilling stories to life. Who knows, maybe you have a scary story of your own to share. If you do, feel free to send it to me. I'd love to feature it on the channel. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, the darkness is always closer than you think. Sweet dreams.